I'm Ram Narayan. I'm a partner at Kirkland Ellis based in Hong Kong, and I focus on private equity M&A investments across Asia, including in India.
Can you explain that? So, who is Kirkland Ellis and what is your interest in India?
Kirkland Ellis is one of the largest private equity focused law firms in the world, and we've been in Asia for about 15 years now and sort of riding the growth of private equity in Asia. And we've been seeing large opportunities in India over the past few years, and that's where sort of I come in, and it obviously gives me an opportunity to leverage my background as an Indian person and sort of witness the growth of private equity in India and sort of be part of that story.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit more about the structuring options that exist. So for an overseas investor, for say a sovereign wealth fund or a pension fund sitting somewhere, say in the US, um, what are the best options for them to consider investing in India?
One of the structures that we've started to see a lot of starting around 2015 or 2016 is investment platforms where there's capital being provided by a foreign investor and they're working hand in hand with a local operator in India. So for example, somebody like an Everstone or somebody like a Piramal, um, Xander Group, we're seeing people outside of India wanting the expertise of local operators with very good reputations,
Mm.
and they sort of trust them to manage some of the investments, and obviously they have a large amount of capital to deploy. So we work on structuring these types of joint venture arrangements for investments, and recently we're seeing a lot of this in the real estate space and the infrastructure space.
Is that the GP to GP? So it's an overseas GP partnering with an Indian GP. That's
It's an overseas GP partnering with an Indian GP. Sometimes it's an overseas LP partnering with an Indian GP. So we sort of see both of those types of investment.
so they make a partnership arrangement rather than an arm's length investment through a fund.
That's right. They make a partnership arrangement. They set up a company. Oftentimes these are companies set up in Singapore, and then they use the sort of overseas platform to then
Mm.
invest downstream into India.
What has changed over the past few years in terms of the Singapore arrangements?
And we've seen a lot of favorable developments from the Singapore government
Mm,
to incentivize the asset management industry
mm,
in Singapore. And
mm,
obviously, there's a regional competition between places like Singapore and Hong Kong. And
mm.
in the general sort of stakes, I think Singapore is having a slightly more favorable approach in recent
I think,
times.
I mean, Singapore, Hong Kong compete on just generally on the asset management industry, but specifically for India, I think Singapore hands down, right?
Yes, I think for India, I think Singapore is the main jurisdiction.
But everyone knows that if you are structuring anything through Mauritius, it's obviously for tax reasons, right? I mean, nobody actually lives there. Um, That's right, right? You're saying this on
Yes.
camera. But tell me, but there is a move towards onshoring the funds management industry, right? What are you seeing there? Are they doing things enough to bring fund managers to be based in India?
We're seeing developments, and part of the panels that we're talking today is to incentivize sort of onshoring or sort of mid-shoring to try and bring some of that onshore into India. And I think we're happy to see sort of some of that, or at least me personally, I'm happy to see some of that sort of
But
move
is it
towards
working? I
India.
mean, as somebody said, I mean, GIFT has been in the making for so many years, but yet, I mean, how many people have actually set up shop in GIFT?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, it was an idea that started with the Modi government, a few years ago, and it's taken its time towards getting to implementation, and so I think people are always wary about being the first mover for these types of new
But
arrangements, and
isn't
so
it unrealistic? It's the same reason for Mauritius, right? I mean, Singapore is a city where you can bring your family and let your kids. I mean, fund managers are people, right? They have
right.
families. They have to have a social life, so they can live in Singapore. But living in Mauritius or living in Gift is unreasonable. I mean, unreasonable in terms of them having a social life, right? So, would you sort of say that this gift might never take off? I mean, there's always this push for Mumbai to become the financial center of India rather than, or it is a financial center, but it should be the international financial center.
Right. I wouldn't personally discount it. I mean, from a personal standpoint, my brother-in-law, who's born and raised in the U.S., of Indian sort of descent, has now moved to India and is living here in Delhi in Chanakyapuri, and he
Delhi is
runs.
fine. Mumbai is fine.
Right.
Are you going to live in Gujarat?
Yeah, I think people are open to moving to places where there are opportunities and career opportunities, and
We
so
haven't seen anyone move there.
I think maybe it's a matter of time. I think to wait to see the legal and regulatory development, I think, to sort of precede some of that.
But realistically, no, given that it hasn't happened, and every year I ask the same question, given that people haven't moved there, what I'm asking is, would you not recommend that Mumbai become, or we set up another IFSC in Mumbai? That would be a more viable, feasible option.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll leave it to the sort of local folks to determine the optimal placing of the zone.
Mm.
But in terms of sort of working in India, I think that becomes more and more palatable over time. And I think it's the same thing with people living in Hong Kong and working in China. I think
Mm.
that's, eventually you started seeing more and more folks moving into places like Shanghai
Mm.
and within the mainland. So I think I don't see that in and of itself as being a barrier. I think once the
Mm.
right regulatory environment is there,
Mm.
the talent will sort of move where the opportunity is.
Mm. What else has happened in the structuring space? I mean, how did the last budget change any of the implications for people investing in India?
I understand that there have been some recent tax developments that may not have been as favorable, and I think people are still sort of working through the details of that, and I think we'll sort of see how all of that plays out. Yeah, I think the initial sort of impression was that it was not as favorable for investment, and I think the stock market sort of reacted to that as well.
That's on the listed space, but in the private equity space, do you get a sense that with all the tax changes announced, that India is open for sort of welcoming overseas investors into India?
I think there's been a slightly more challenging environment recently, and I think that's something that's happening in India, and I think that's happening globally as well. So I think that's just one of the hurdles that private equity firms have to deal with, and one of the ways they deal with it is in sort of focusing on a longer term horizon,
Mm.
different sort of structures for dealing with end of life of funds, permanent capital type funds. I think people are trying to come up with products to try to mitigate against some of these, and this is just one of the challenges that I think folks have to work through.
How do you keep up with developments in India? I mean, do you actually sort of, are you part of the IVCA? Are you a member?
I'm not a member of the IVCA, but we have very close relationships with a lot of the Indian law firms,
Mm.
and so we meet with them and talk to them on
Mm.
a regular basis. They're often sort of visiting in Singapore and Hong Kong, and so we obviously love to keep abreast of
Mm.
developments that are important for our clients.
How long have you been doing deals in India?
I've been doing deals in India for about 10 years, so I think most of my practice have involved sort of deals in India. I think the other sort of trend I think is well spoken about. I think there's been a gravitation from more minority interest to control investments, and we're seeing some of those be successful. We're seeing more exits, which earlier was a problem for private equity. So I think, bit by bit, you're seeing some of these hurdles sort of fall away, or at least people understanding the risks and then figuring out structures to deal with it or anticipating it and building that into their model. And so I think you see some of those types of changes, which are obviously helpful. I think the government and regulatory backdrop, I think all over can be subject to flux, and I think people are now sort of anticipating that, and so I don't sort of view that as necessarily a hurdle for investment. There's a tremendous amount of capital that's available to deploy, and if that sort of continues to be the case, which it seems to be on a global basis, some amount of that will have to come to Asia, and some amount of that will come to India, and there's a competition for those funds, and so it depends on how markets in China or Korea or Japan are doing and how people are looking at economic growth in India relative to all of those. And I think fortunately India has, at least in the recent years, been doing economically better than a lot of other regions in the world. And so that still is an attractive opportunity. It's one of the few places where you can get sizable deals to deploy capital, one of the few places where there are sufficient underlying fundamentals for long-term growth. So I think all of that helps, and I think you just have to sort of mitigate some of the risks around that, and structuring is sort of one way to do that, and obviously hiring lawyers is another way to do that.
So what, in the past 10 years, what have you seen in terms of the terms that investors need to be careful about that are being put into in these contracts?
Well, I
Apart
think,
from the control bit?
and I think one of the most interesting things that we're seeing in these types of platform investments that are being set up with foreign funds, foreign capital, and Indian operators is sort of transposing of structures that work in the U.S. and the U.K. And once you sort of bring those into India, um, you have to sort of work around the edges a little bit, and there's some amount of sort of translation as to what might make sense there may not make sense here. And so one of the things is what happens to an operator in case of bad circumstances. underperformance or criminal liability. And I think there's definitions that are set in the U.S. that everybody knows as a market expectation, and you have a sense of how it works. But in India, maybe that's a little more in flux, and so you have to sort of revisit how some of those provisions work and get sort of both the foreign expectations met as well as the domestic operators' expectations met. So I think there's those are some areas where we've seen more tensions in negotiations.
What about the jurisdiction? As much as people sort of like the common law, the English law kind of sort of basis on which Indian courts are based, the fact that there is a backlog of so many cases scares people, right? So what do you see people are preferring as jurisdictions for these platforms?
For these platforms, I think we're generally seeing Singapore as a platform that folks are comfortable with. So for India deals, we often see Singapore arbitration as sort of a tried and tested mechanism.
Have you seen any cases go to arbitration? And
Not me personally. I'm sort of on the investment side of it. So we do the investments, and that would go sort of to folks more well-versed in the litigation side.
But you haven't seen any particular views on any issues that have come up in the last 10 years that people should be aware of? So what has gone wrong is sort of a different way.
I think that the thing that folks are always worried about is something like an Abraj scandal or something like that, right? So I think, at least from a sort of U.S. perspective, I think people are worried about things like outright sort of fraud, and I think the key type of protection that we tend to look for is what happens in sort of the worst case scenario. I think fortunately, there have been obviously cases of those types of incidents in India, but not necessarily a big one in the private equity space. So I think you've seen things like the Nirav Modi sort of issue and things with Kingfisher. I think all those types of things, and so there's that sort of ever-present risk that some of this might happen, but in the sort of private equity space, I think people do spend time on diligence, and all of that as one way of mitigating that. Sort of overseas type jurisdictions is something that people get comfortable with for dispute resolution in those types of circumstances. And so I think that's something that people are cognizant of or worried about.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.